Well, the research is clear. People increasingly don't trust the media, primarily because the reporting in the news is biased and not balanced, and the news is too much a result of the political leaning of the newsroom. Now, that's not just my view. That's the view of surveys throughout the world, and here in New Zealand. We all want balanced coverage, even if we disagree with the opposing view. But now, the owner of one of the most prestigious newspapers has admitted that what we're all thinking is correct. Will it change anything and save the industry? Good question. So Jeff Bezos is the founder, executive chairman and former president and CEO of Amazon, which of course is the world's largest e-commerce and cloud computing company. He's the second wealthiest person in the world. He's got a net worth of $211 billion US, but who's counting? I mean, think Bill Gates, Elon Musk, George Soros, etc. Jeff Bezos is also the owner of the Washington Post, a rabid left-wing newspaper in the US, similar to the New York Times, The Guardian in the UK, Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, and all of our news media in New Zealand, the New Zealand Herald, the Post in Wellington, the Press in Christchurch, and the woeful Otago Daily Times in Dunedin. None of them are trusted. Now, how do I know this? Well, it's what you, the consumers, are saying. Most recently, the fifth report about trust in New Zealand news was produced by AUT in collaboration with the Reuters Institute for the study of journalism in news. And in 2020, just over half of us trusted the news in general, but in 2024, that figure had slid to 33%. In 5 years, general trust in the news had fallen 20 percentage points. Just 1 in 3 New Zealanders trust the news media. But here's the key graph, in my view, from that report, the reasons not to trust the news. And you'll see the top 4 there with the yellow out the right, just to mark them, and they've all increased. The reasons: the reporting in the news is biased, not balanced. News is too much a result of the political leaning of the newsroom. The news is too opinionated and lacks factual information. And there is a lack of transparency in the way the news media operates. And note the fifth one down there, I didn't highlight it, but 61% of us say government financial support for the media in New Zealand means you cannot trust journalists to hold the government to account. And 2 weeks ago, a news survey was reported. It was entitled Selective and Consistent News Avoidance in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Motivations and Democratic Influences. And it was by academics from Victoria University and University of Otago. And what it found was that 60% of survey participants in New Zealand reported they sometimes, often, or almost always avoid the news. Now, if you add in the rarely avoid it, then 81% of us avoid the news to some extent. But they also found a high number of consistent news avoiders. 13% of participants said that they avoid the news almost always. They boycott it. Now, the average around the world is 3% and a high of 10% for consistent news avoiders. So we are one of the highest in the world. But it's not just New Zealand. Just last week, Gallup polling revealed that Americans continue to register record low trust in the mass media, with only 31% expressing a great deal or fair amount of confidence in the media to report the news fully, accurately and fairly. So it's about 1 in 3. That's the same as New Zealand. But here's their trend line. The green line is, yep, they trust the media a great deal. The blue line is that they trust the media not very much. And the dotted line is they don't trust the media at all. You'll see there, the green line has dropped from 2018 in the more recent years, and the no trust line has exploded since 2018. So this is before COVID even appeared on the scene. So you can't blame COVID. Now, here's the breakdown in terms of Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right. And remember that virtually all mainstream media in the US is left-leaning, including the Washington Post and the New York Times and the LA Times. The exceptions would be Fox News and the New York Post, and maybe a few other smaller ones. So the trust in media by those on the right, conservatives, is the red line. And it is rock bottom. Just over 1 in 10 say they trust the media. I'm surprised it's as high as 12%, given the state of the media in the US as well. But even just over half of left-wing Democrats trust the media also, the blue line. And it's falling. Now, the dotted line is independents, people who aren't quite sure if they're Democrat or Republican. But what was most interesting about the data from Gallup is that it's up-and-coming generations, the younger generations, that are turning away from the legacy media. But they're the future consumers. For example, in this polling, young Democrats trust the media far less than older Democrats do. 31% of young Democrats aged 18 to 29 trust the media versus 74% of those aged 65 and older. But you can see the problem, eh? As the older generations die, so too does the audience. Now, Jeff Bezos is not a reporter, journalist pushing a narrative at any cost. He's a businessman, and he can see the writing on the wall. He's smart. But he's only as smart as you and me, because we can also see it happening and we know why it's happening. And much to the annoyance of all his left-wing readers and his left-wing staff and editors, he said that the paper would not endorse a presidential candidate. Now, according to a report by the BBC, also a left-wing outlet that doesn't know what a woman is, they said the decision to stop endorsing a presidential candidate announced just days before the election broke with a custom the Post had generally followed for decades. The paper has endorsed a candidate in most presidential elections since the 70s. The Washington Post Guild's leadership, which represents workers at the paper, said it was deeply concerned by the decision. We are already seeing cancellations from once loyal readers, the Guild said in its statement. This decision undercuts the work of our members at a time when we should be building our readers' trust, not losing it. The paper has lost as many as 200,000 digital subscribers, and several editorial staff, including board members, have stepped down. Actually, 200,000 subscribers in the United States with hundreds of millions actually probably isn't that much. The Washington Post reported, citing two sources briefed on the sequence of events who were not authorised to speak publicly, that editorial staffers had planned to endorse Vice President Kamala Harris, but the article was never published. Well, strike me down with a feather. They were going to endorse Kamala. In addition to the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times and USA Today have also announced they will not endorse a presidential candidate this time. Maybe that's because that's how bad the Democrat option is. But the media generally don't like taking blame, so they blame others. And of course, the insinuation is it's all Trump's fault. But this decline was happening well before he turned up on the scene and called them out. But have a watch how CNN handles this issue.
That's not true. He's taking a principled stand. He's trying to restore trust in institutions. But I want to recognize that for all the flaws of the mainstream media, and we have a lot of them, it's not just the media's fault that trust has been declining for decades. It's also decades of attacks by politicians.
That is the main issue, is that it could be that the Washington Post is endorsing candidates, or it could be that there are millions of voters who believe lying politicians who tell them lies, knowing that they are.
Yes, it's all those nasty politicians calling out the biased media. It's all the politicians' fault. But anyway, this week, Jeff Bezos called out the trust issue in an opinion piece, and he explains why newspapers shouldn't be endorsing someone. And let me read it to you. It's entitled, "The Hard Truth, Americans Don't Trust the News Media." And it's a note from our owner, the owner of the newspaper, and he says this. In the annual public surveys about trust and reputation, journalists in the media have regularly fallen near the bottom, often just above Congress politicians. But in this year's Gallup poll, which we just looked at, we have managed to fall below the politicians. Our profession is now the least trusted of all. Something we are doing is clearly not working. Let me give you an analogy. Voting machines must meet two requirements. They must count the vote accurately, and people must believe they count the vote accurately. The second requirement is distinct from and just as important as the first. Actually, that's an interesting analogy given all the concerns over what happened in 2020. Maybe he knows something that we don't. But he continues, likewise with newspapers, here's the key bit. We must be accurate, and we must be believed to be accurate. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but we are failing on the second requirement. Most people believe the media is biased. Anyone who doesn't see this is paying scant attention to reality, and those who fight reality lose. Reality is an undefeated champion. It would be easy to blame others for the long and continuing fall in credibility, like CNN just did, and therefore decline in impact, but a victim mentality will not help. Complaining is not a strategy. We must work harder to control what we can control to increase our credibility. I mean, wow, he has just said out loud what we were all thinking. Presidential endorsements do nothing to tip the scales of an election. No undecided voter in Pennsylvania are going to say, I'm going with newspaper A's endorsement. None. What presidential endorsements actually do is create a perception of bias, a perception of non-independence. Ending them is a principled decision, and it's the right one. Eugene Meyer, publisher of the Washington Post from 1933 to 1946, thought the same, and he was right. By itself, declining to endorse presidential candidates is not enough to move us very far up the trust scale, but it's a meaningful step in the right direction. I wish we had made the change earlier than we did, in a moment further from the election and the emotions around it. That was inadequate planning and not some intentional strategy. And then further down the op-ed, he concludes, lack of credibility isn't unique to the Post. Our brethren newspapers have the same issue, and it's a problem not only for media, but also for the nation. Many people are turning to off-the-cuff podcasts, inaccurate social media posts, and other unverified news sources which can quickly spread misinformation and deepen divisions. The Washington Post and the New York Times win prizes, but increasingly we talk only to a certain elite. More and more, we talk to ourselves. While I do not and will not push my personal interest, I will also not allow this paper to stay on autopilot and fade into irrelevance, overtaken by unresearched podcasts and social media barbs. Not without a fight. It's too important. Actually, let me just interject there and say that some of the material I'm reading on Substack, on some independent blogs, even our blogs and Family Matters, etc., there is significant research and source links. So that claim of unresearched podcasts and social media barbs, well, it's just gaslighting. It's false. Anyway, he says, the stakes are too high. Now more than ever, the world needs a credible, trusted, independent voice, and we're better for that voice to originate than the capital city of the most important country in the world. To win this fight, we will have to exercise new muscles. Some changes will be a return to the past, and some will be new inventions. Criticism will be part and parcel of anything new, of course. This is the way of the world. None of this will be easy, but it will be worth it. I am so grateful to be part of this endeavour. Many of the finest journalists you'll find anywhere work at the Washington Post, and they work painstakingly every day to get to the truth. They deserve to be believed. Well, let me conclude with what I always say when discussing this issue. Until the media industry's desire to push an agenda doesn't outweigh their desire to survive and report both sides, which they need to place the focus on doing that, they're in big trouble. You only have to watch the New Zealand media coverage of the US election at the moment to see how deeply biased they are towards one candidate. Everyone can see it. Even supporters of Kamala can see it. They just don't mind it as much. Yep, individually there are some fantastic, committed journalists with integrity. But as an industry, it's corrupt, broken, and on its knees. Will it get back up again? Just don't know. But as someone who was involved in the media, as I keep telling you, it is very sad that we've got to this point. The good news is that there are now lots of alternatives, and you're watching one of them. Well-researched, accountable to you. So it's not all bad news.